Hi guys, I am the Comics Kid 2099, and I wanted to talk a little bit about one of my favorite X-Men characters, Magneto. I don't know if I've ever said this before, but Magneto is my favorite supervillain, and he is probably one of my favorite X-Men characters. Now, I do want to lay down some disclaimers real quick. Not every Magneto story is especially awesome or especially poignant or anything like that. For example, if you go back to the 1960s X-Men comics, Magneto is basically your Snidely Whiplash of the X-Men universe. He is not a very deep character. He's basically just twirling his mustache and saying, I am evil and I'm going to do evil things to you guys. And that's okay, you know, it's the 1960s. Not every comic book from around that time was especially bold or charismatic or whatever. And I will say that X-Men is one of the Silver Age Marvel titles that kind of suffered from Jack Kirby and Stan Lee working on so many titles at that time. Magneto didn't really become interesting until, I'm not even kidding, 1981. And to put that into perspective for you, he first appeared in 1963. And this is, of course, all my opinion, but Magneto was basically just the, I am going to rise and I'm going to fight the X-Men. That was basically his modus operandi until 1981, which is when we got Uncanny X-Men issue 150. And that was the first time that we ever found out that he was a Holocaust survivor. And this was also, I believe, the very same issue where we also first found out that Charles Xavier and Magneto used to be friends before Magneto turned to the dark side, if you will. And both of these elements, I think, for people who are coming into the X-Men now, or they come to the comics through the movies, it's almost impossible to imagine an X-Men world where Magneto and Charles Xavier are not friends with each other before they go their separate ways, or a world where Magneto is not a Holocaust survivor. Both of these elements are so intrinsically tied to the character that it's hard to imagine him without these elements. And like I say, it was almost 20 years after Magneto was created that these elements were introduced. And in my opinion, they make Magneto a much more interesting character. X-Men 150 takes him and turns him from a straight-up villain and kind of turns him into more of an anti-hero. He's very extreme, he has good intentions, but he does very extreme things, sometimes very bad things, to get to his good intentions. And I really think the character of Magneto is very interesting because of that. He's, in my opinion, more interesting than most of the actual X-Men characters. Now, after the backstory of Magneto as a Holocaust survivor was introduced, a few years later, around the time of Secret Wars 2, Magneto joined the X-Men. Now, I have not read Secret Wars 2. I kind of want to, just to see Magneto's fundamental choice to say, okay, I'm done fighting you guys, maybe we can work together. I think that is a huge moment in Magneto as a character. I really think it's a crime that this did not happen in the actual X-Men comic book, but I haven't read Secret Wars 2, so I cannot speak to that particular moment itself. However, around this time, Magneto, he joins the X-Men, and then a few issues later, Mystique and her Brotherhood, they are now working for the government, and they arrest Magneto for his crimes against humanity. And he says, you know what? I'm just going to face the music. We're going to figure out what the trial says, and whatever it says, I'm going to go through with it. Around this time, Professor Xavier, long story short, he was sick. I don't want this to be an extremely long video, so I'm not going to talk about what all was going on with Professor X, but he was so sick that the Starjammers and his girlfriend, Princess Lilandra, or Empress Lilandra, they took him into outer space to cure him. And then, again, long story short, Professor Xavier was stranded in outer space, and allegedly he was never going to come back again. Now, this was around the time of 1983, 1985, something like that. I think Professor Xavier did come back to the X-Men by 1990. I think that was when he was permanently back on Earth. And anyway, right before Professor Xavier leaves Earth, he says to his old friend, listen, you need to lead the X-Men and take charge of the school. Be the teacher for the New Mutants. And Magneto, he's kind of saying in his mind, I am not a teacher. Listen, I don't really think this is a good idea. But Professor X makes him swear to take care of the New Mutants to the best of his ability. Now, at this point, he was more or less a good guy. He was with the X-Men. Some of the X-Men didn't really like this. Some of them were a little bit more okay with it than others. Kitty Pryde, she had kind of grown attached to Magneto because they were both Jewish, and so she found out when they went to this ceremony that Magneto had actually been in the same camp as her grandfather or her great uncle, something like that. So they had kind of formed a bond with each other. But then you had other characters like Cyclops. He was very against the idea of Magneto being part of the team. Now, incidentally, this is also probably my favorite era of Magneto stories. When he is with the X-Men, that is a moment in his character that I think is where he hit his peak. I thought, this is really interesting. We've got a character who somewhat organically has gone from being a villain to being an ally to the X-Men. And this is not a new thing with the X-Men, although I would say Magneto is probably the first character to go from being a villain to being an ally to the team. Since then, we've had characters like Emma Frost and the Juggernaut. They have also left the side of evil, if you will, and gone to work with the X-Men. For Juggernaut, it was somewhat brief, and for Emma Frost, it's still going on. Basically, though, from a storytelling perspective, I guess you could say some people saw this to be problematic because Magneto was seen as the X-Men villain. Now, around this time, Chris Claremont was working on a new big villain, Mr. Sinister. He was just very far in the background at this point. He wasn't showing up at all. And then you also had the Hellfire Club, which around this time the X-Men tended to call the Hellfire Club our greatest enemies. So they did have some other villains. It wasn't like they have no villains, what are we going to do? But eventually, around the time when Chris Claremont left the X-Men, this was 1991, Magneto basically became a villain once again. Now, I have talked about how I really wish that Chris Claremont did not leave the X-Men franchise in the way that he did. But long story short, he was frustrated with his co-worker artist Jim Lee, and Jim Lee was kind of going over his head, and then editorial was siding with Jim Lee, and so Chris Claremont was frustrated and he left. So I'm not exactly sure if turning Magneto back into a villain was Chris Claremont's idea or if it was Jim Lee's idea. But this is something that happened. In fact, this was the last storyline that Chris Claremont worked on before he left the title. And in my opinion, turning Magneto back into a full-on, I am going to be fighting you guys, was not really a great place to take the character. A year or two before Chris Claremont did leave the book, we did have a moment where Magneto was saying, listen, I will do whatever it takes to protect mutant kind. That's what my goals have always been, and that's still what my goals are. And then you had characters like Moira McTaggart and Banshee. They were kind of saying, okay, we can't trust him anymore. So maybe this was the direction that Claremont was taking Magneto. I don't know. But in my opinion, I really think that Magneto could have been more interesting if he had just stayed with the good guys. And it's also entirely possible, around this time, 1991, remember, the animated series was about to be a thing, and that was hugely influenced by the Jim Lee era of the book, where they had those designs that Jim Lee had worked on for the costumes. So it's possible that they just wanted to restore Magneto as the villain to the X-Men so that the animated series could do the, air quotes, classic X-Men status quo. Now, what I find very interesting about this turn of events where Magneto kind of goes back to being the bad guy, if you will, is that A, the story tried to explain why Magneto became a good guy in the first place, or became an ally to the X-Men. In the 70s, this was also in a comic book I did not read, I believe it was in the Champions comic book series, Magneto was turned into an infant by a creature called Mutant Alpha. I have not read this comic, so I really only peripherally know what went on, but basically this happened, and then in the early 90s, in Chris Claremont's final story, a retcon was put in place where, according to this story, Moira McTaggart experimented on baby Magneto so that he could, when he was grown up again, no longer be as evil as he was in the first place. Now, I have several issues with this. First and foremost, the Mutant Alpha turning Magneto into a baby thing, that was undone, and Magneto was now in his 30s, and he was still evil. He was, air quotes, a bad guy for a few more stories, and it wasn't until 8 years later, after the Mutant Alpha storyline, where finally Magneto joined the X-Men. So this retcon, trying to explain why Magneto was, air quotes, a good guy, I think just didn't really work. It just felt like Jim Lee was saying, well, I don't like the idea of Magneto being a good guy, So let's explain that that's not even in his character. And it just doesn't really work logistically. If you take a look at the Mutant Alpha story and then you find where Magneto actually joined the X-Men, there's plenty of stories in between where Magneto was an air quotes villain. So the idea that Maury McTaggart turned him into a good guy really would have worked a lot better if he had joined the X-Men immediately after Mutant Alpha turned him into a baby. But that's not what happened, so long story short, I do feel like this retcon is very sloppy. Now, I have gone on a few tangents here, and I apologize for that, but what I was going to say was that what's very interesting here is that Magneto, air quotes, became a villain once again in the first 3 issues of Adjectiveless X-Men. And then he died. It was believed that Magneto died in this storyline where he becomes a full-on villain once again. And then, honestly, we don't have that many Magneto as a villain stories in the 1990s. Now, I will go ahead and say that the 1990s is the era of X-Men stories that I am the least familiar with. I have the fewest stories from that time period. But if you go and look, there are not that many Magneto as a villain stories. I don't think he was heavily featured in the Onslaught storyline. I know that he was featured pretty heavily in the Age of Apocalypse. However, that was an alternate version of him, so for the sake of this video, it's not even the same character. I know that in the late 90s, he once again was kind of featured in a big story where, long story short, he became the sovereign leader of Genosha or Genosha. I don't really know how it's pronounced. I think it's Genosha, but I've always said Genosha. He became the sovereign leader of this island. And then you flash forward another year or two, and Grant Morrison's run on New X-Men begins. And here is when things get really crazy. Morrison allegedly kills Magneto in the opening issue of his run. Then, near the end of his run, he reveals that the character known as Zorn was actually Magneto all along. And then the character who we will call Zornito, he takes thousands of humans and puts them in these trailers, and he is going to burn them, and it kind of is supposed to be evoking feelings of the Holocaust. And a lot of people, even people who I would submit aren't very much fans of the character of Magneto, they were pretty upset because this is not something that Magneto would do. Even if you prefer Magneto as a villain to the X-Men, and by this point he had been for about 14 years, it had been about that long since Claremont left the X-Men and had allegedly killed Magneto at that point. Even if you prefer Magneto as that, it still feels very false that Magneto would resort to tactics that the Nazis used. And I do understand that for the purposes of dramatic tension, it kind of is Magneto's thing. He goes from being a victim of the Nazis to kind of being his own version of the Nazis against humanity. And that's all part of his character. But at the same time, I don't think the character, after going through years of character development, would resort to saying, okay, I'm going to incinerate all of these humans. Even at his worst, I don't think Magneto ever would have done that. And clearly I was not the only one who thought this, because immediately after Grant Morrison left New X-Men, we had 2 comic books trying to resolve this whole Zornito thing. In the Adjectiveless X-Men comic book, which was New X-Men, we found out that there really was a mutant named Zorn. He was a shapeshifter. He was pretending to be Magneto, pretending to be Zorn, and so that was not Magneto. Meanwhile, in the Excalibur comic, which was written by Chris Claremont, we had Charles Xavier going to Genosha, which now had like 15 mutants on it, and he was going to try and train these younger mutants and teach them in the use of their powers. We see that Magneto is alive and well, and he's shaking Charles's hand, and he's saying, listen, that wasn't me, and Charles is saying, I know. And so for about a year or two, not very long at all, we've got Magneto once again kind of on the side of the Angels. He's not outright working with the X-Men because at this point Charles Xavier is not working with the X-Men, but he is working with Charles and they're doing some good work on Genosha/Genosha. And then we have a story called House of M. Long story short, this is a story where Quicksilver convinces the Scarlet Witch to alter reality so that Magneto is Lord and Sovereign of the entire planet. Then a few heroes, they reverse this, and then Magneto is basically depowered by the events of this story. I am not a huge fan of House of M, so we will not linger here too much. But from this point on, Magneto is powerless, but he is trying to get his powers back, and he's sort of seen as, once again, a little bit of an extremist. He is saying, listen, I'm going to do whatever it takes to protect mutant kind, even if it means that I am viewed as a villain by most of the world. So once again, the writers are kind of taking Magneto down the villainous road. And this was also around the time when I stopped reading X-Men comics. I stopped reading comic books, single issues if you will, in 2009, which was the year that the X-Men Second Coming storyline happened. And I believe this is also when Magneto full-on joined the X-Men once again. This time he's saying, listen, as you know, my goal has always been to protect mutant kind. And it seems to me that the best way to do that is to join you guys, because you guys seem to know what you're doing, and I want to help you do what you're doing. And then jump forward a few more years, and we've got the X-Men kind of split. We've got the less militant X-Men, led by Wolverine and Storm, I think. Like I say, I haven't been reading much X-Men lately. And then you've got the more militant X-Men who are saying, listen, we will revolt, we will have a riot. And that is the team led by Cyclops, and Magneto is part of that team. Now, I went through this ridiculously long history lesson to basically say, in my opinion, Magneto never should have left the X-Men in 1991. I think that he has always been more interesting as a former villain who is now trying to preach the path of peace. He might go up to one of his former followers and say, listen, I know what I used to be like, but there's a better way. Maybe you could come join the X-Men. And these guys are saying, listen, you are a race traitor, and I hate you, and I will never listen to you again. Stuff like that. I think that that is a more fertile ground to take Magneto, especially when, if you look at his history as a character, he has been an air quotes bad guy for most of his existence. It's only been about, I want to say, 7 years total that he has been allied with the X-Men. And I really think that now we've got some writers who are trying to take him down that path. For example, before House of M, Chris Claremont clearly seemed to be working with the idea that Magneto is no longer that kind of guy. But then you have other writers who are saying, maybe it'd be cool if he was a bad guy. So in Ed Brubaker's run on X-Men, Magneto was clearly not the same Magneto that Chris Claremont was working with just a few short years earlier. So I'm curious what you guys have to say about this. Do you prefer Magneto as a full-on villain? Do you prefer him as more of an ally to the X-Men? Or do you prefer to see him as an extreme anti-hero, which is kind of how I see him, but I also like the idea of him being an anti-hero who just happens to be working with the X-Men. What do you guys think? I hope you will comment in this video or make video responses. And if you like this video, I hope you will like, share, comment, and subscribe. And I will see you guys tomorrow with a different kind of video. I'll catch you later. Have a good day.